Close your eyes for a second. Picture a Native American. Whatever just appeared in your mind, the feathered headdress, the painted face on a horse, the stoic elder gazing across a canyon, maybe even a Thanksgiving tableau. I want you to hold on to that image. Keep it right there, because by the end of what you're about to hear, that image will be gone. Not because it's wrong, exactly. It's more like calling a skyscraper a building. Technically true, completely, catastrophically incomplete. The real story, the one that actually happened, is stranger, darker, more violent, more beautiful, and more relevant to understanding who we are right now than anything Hollywood has ever put on a screen. Here's the truth nobody put in the textbook. The people who lived on this continent before everything changed were not one thing. They were not a chapter. They were not background scenery in someone else's story. They were an entire civilization. No, hundreds of civilizations, operating with political systems, military strategies, economies, art forms, and philosophical traditions that rival anything human beings have ever produced. Anywhere, ever. And some of what they did was breathtaking. And some of what they did was horrifying. And most of it was both. This is not a story of noble savages living in paradise until the Europeans arrived to ruin everything. That's a comfortable story. It's also a lie. And it's not a story of primitive peoples who simply couldn't compete with a more advanced civilization. That's an even more comfortable story. It's also a lie. This is the story of empires you were never taught, of warriors who terrified entire nations, of cities larger than London, of democratic systems that may have inspired the US Constitution itself, of a world so complex and so alive that its destruction ranks among the great catastrophes of human history. And it is also the story of what survives, what refuses to die, what's still here, still breathing, still insisting on being seen. We're going back, way back, before the highways, before the state lines, before anyone called this place America. Let's go. Before we talk about the people, we need to rebuild the world they lived in. Because the world you know, the one with the interstates and the suburbs and the strip malls and the amber waves of commodity grain, that world is a replacement, a substitution, a before and after where somebody forgot to show you the before. So let's start over. Strip the continent bare. No cities, no farms carved into geometric squares, no roads, no fences, no political borders drawn by men in rooms who had never seen the land they were dividing. What you're left with is something that the human brain, trained on parking lots and glass towers, genuinely struggles to process. You're left with a continent of almost incomprehensible biological abundance. A living system so vast and so interconnected and so explosively productive that even the people who lived inside it knew they were inhabiting something sacred. Start in the east. Forests, not the fragmented managed woodlands you can drive through on a Sunday afternoon, but real forests, ancient forests, forests that had been accumulating biomass and complexity for 10,000 years without interruption. The canopy was so complete that sunlight arrived at the forest floor the way light arrives at the bottom of the ocean, filtered, dim, miraculous. Oak and maple and chestnut and pine, so massive that a single tree could shelter a family from rain. trees so old they had been growing since before the Roman Empire fell. There was a saying, probably apocryphal but pointing at something real, that a squirrel could travel from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Mississippi River, roughly 1,000 miles, without ever touching the ground. Just leaping from branch to branch, from crown to crown, through an unbroken highway of leaves. Think about that image for a second. 1,000 miles of unbroken forest canopy. Now move west. The forest thins, the land opens, and suddenly you're in the grasslands, the Great Plains. And here, language starts to fail. Because the plains were not simply large, they were a different category of existence. They were a sensory experience that early European observers, people trained on the comparatively cramped landscapes of England and France and Spain, literally could not find words for. Flat. But not just flat. The land had a curvature to it, like you were standing on the surface of something enormous, which of course you were. The sky wasn't overhead, it was everywhere. It pressed down from above, rose up from the horizon on all four sides simultaneously, and turned the human body into the smallest, most fragile object in existence. You didn't stand on the plains. You floated inside the sky, and the grass, waist-high in some places, taller than a man in others, moving in waves when the wind came through, and the wind always came through. Not the polite breezes of the eastern seaboard. Real wind, architectural wind, wind that had nothing to stop it for 500 miles and had built up opinions about where it was going. But here's the thing that really breaks the modern mind. The animals. The buffalo. We're going to come back to the buffalo many times in this story, because you cannot understand what happened on this continent without understanding them first. But for now, just try to hold one number in your head. At peak population, there were somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison on the North American plains. 30 to 60 million. For context, the current human population of California is about 39 million. Imagine replacing every person in California, every single one, with an animal that weighs a ton, moves in herds, and when those herds run, the ground shakes for miles in every direction, and the dust cloud rises high enough to block the sun. That's what was here. One observer in the 1870s, already late in the story, after the herds had been significantly reduced, described encountering a single bison herd that took 4 days to pass, not 4 minutes. 4 days. He estimated the herd covered an area roughly the size of Rhode Island. That was one herd, among hundreds. Beyond the plains, there was the Southwest. Red rock, sandstone, canyon country, desert that looked dead but wasn't. A landscape that had been teaching people how to survive in impossible conditions for millennia, and where those people had developed agricultural techniques that could coax food from earth most farmers would walk away from in despair. And in the Northwest, the rainforests, ancient cedars wrapped in moss, their bark the texture of old skin, their roots drinking from rivers that ran silver with salmon. During spawning season, you could walk across the water on the backs of fish, not metaphorically, literally. The rivers turned solid with them, and everywhere, water. The Mississippi River system alone drained nearly half the continent, a liquid highway network connecting the northern forests to the Gulf of Mexico. The Great Lakes, 5 of them, clustered in the upper Midwest, held roughly a fifth of the world's surface fresh water. Inland seas, large enough to generate ocean-sized storms, capable of swallowing boats and ambitions with equal indifference. This was the world, full, teeming, impossibly alive. When Europeans first looked at this continent, and this is crucial, they saw emptiness. It's one of the most consequential misreads in human history, and it was not an accident. It was a function of seeing through the wrong lens. Europeans came from a world defined by fixed settlements, permanent structures, fences, property markers, cultivated fields, roads, and the relentless visible evidence of human occupation. They had been trained, culturally and cognitively, to recognize human presence by its permanent marks on the landscape, and many parts of North America had no such marks, no fences, no permanent roads, no cleared fields stretching to the horizon, no stone walls delineating ownership. So Europeans looked at a landscape actively managed by millions of human beings and concluded it was unoccupied, waiting, available, terra nullius, empty land, a legal fiction that served enormous practical purposes. But the land wasn't empty. It was managed in ways that were simply invisible to people who didn't know what they were looking at. Those forests that seemed so wild and untouched, many of them were actively maintained through controlled burns that encouraged new growth and created the mosaic of habitats that supported the extraordinary biodiversity Europeans marveled at. The abundance of game, the deer and the turkey and the elk that seemed to offer themselves up so freely, was partly a product of centuries of careful environmental management. The native peoples didn't have a word for wilderness in the European sense, because from their perspective, there was no wilderness. There was only home, managed home, inhabited home, sacred home. What Europeans interpreted as pristine nature was in fact a vast, carefully tended garden. Just one that didn't look like any garden Europeans had ever seen. This misreading, emptiness where there was fullness, would become the intellectual foundation for everything that followed. You cannot steal land from no one. You cannot break treaties with emptiness. The fiction of emptiness was not accidental. It was load-bearing. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why do we say Native Americans as if that's a single thing? We don't say Asians and expect it to convey meaningful information about the difference between a Japanese business person and an Afghan shepherd. We don't say Europeans and assume it tells us something useful about the cultural distance between a Finnish reindeer herder and a Sicilian fisherman. We understand that a continent is not a people. Geography is not identity. And yet, when Europeans arrived on the shores of North America, they encountered hundreds of distinct nations. Some historians say 600, some say 1,000, speaking languages as different from each other as Finnish is from Arabic, practicing religions with no more in common than Buddhism and Catholicism, organizing their societies according to political philosophies that ranged from radical egalitarianism to rigid hereditary hierarchy. The term Native American is, at its core, a European invention. It reflects the European need to categorize, to simplify, to reduce the incomprehensible to something manageable. The people themselves had no such unified identity. A Comanche warrior and a Chinook fisherman, dropped in the same room, would have needed interpreters to exchange a single sentence. Their material cultures, spiritual practices, diets, and social structures would have been as alien to each other as they were to a Spaniard or an Englishman. This matters enormously, because every time we generalize, every time we speak of the Native American perspective or what Native Americans believed, we are committing the same flattening error that made all of this history possible in the first place. There were hundreds of perspectives, hundreds of belief systems, hundreds of answers to the question of how human beings should live. Let's meet a few of them. In the northeastern woodlands, roughly in the area of present-day upstate New York, there existed a political achievement so sophisticated and so radical that it still provokes serious academic debate about whether the Founding Fathers were paying closer attention to it than they liked to admit. The Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, known to Europeans as the Iroquois Confederacy, had, by most estimates, been operating a working federal democracy for somewhere between 200 and over 1,000 years before the Declaration of Independence was signed. The debate over the founding date is itself revealing. The Confederacy was ancient enough that its origins had faded into legend by the time Europeans arrived to observe it. It worked like this: 5 nations, the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Oneida, later joined by the Tuscarora to make 6, had agreed, through a process attributed to a legendary peacemaker named Daganoweda and his partner Hiawatha, to stop killing each other and to govern themselves through a shared council structure. Each nation sent representatives. Decisions required consensus. Any nation could block a decision it found unacceptable. The system had built-in checks and balances, structured debate, and formal procedures for removing leaders who abused their authority. Sound familiar? Here's where it gets really interesting. Women held the foundational power in this system, not in a symbolic or ceremonial sense, in an actual, structural, operational sense. The clan mothers of each nation were responsible for selecting the male chiefs who represented them on the Grand Council. They could also recall and replace those chiefs if they failed to represent their people faithfully. This was matrilineal governance, not matriarchal in the sense of women ruling over men, but matrilineal in the sense that lineage, property, and political legitimacy passed through the female line. The longhouses, those massive communal structures that could stretch 200 feet and house a dozen families, belonged to the women. The agricultural fields. The women's domain, the decision about whether to go to war, required the clan mother's consent because it was their sons and brothers and nephews who would die. When the Continental Congress was trying to figure out how to unite 13 fractious colonies with competing interests and deep mutual suspicions, some of them, Benjamin Franklin most notably, were paying attention to the Haudenosaunee model. The U.S. Congress formally acknowledged in 1988 the Haudenosaunee contribution to American democracy. 2,000 miles southwest, in a landscape of red rock and blue sky and merciless sun, a different civilization had been solving a different set of problems. The Pueblo peoples had been building in the desert for over 1,000 years by the time the Spanish arrived. Picture this: 1,000-year-old apartment complex, 4 stories tall, carved from sandstone and adobe, containing hundreds of rooms and housing hundreds of families, built into the side of a cliff in such a way that the only entrance is by ladder from above. Pull up the ladder, and the entire community is inaccessible to raiders. The design isn't just architecture, it's a security system. The great houses of Chaco Canyon were aligned to solar and lunar cycles with a precision that required both extraordinary astronomical knowledge and multi-generational construction projects. Roads, actual engineered roads, perfectly straight, cut through the desert landscape, connected the great houses to outlier communities across a network that may have served both practical and ceremonial functions. The Three Sisters agricultural system, corn, beans, and squash planted together in a single mound, represents a level of ecological intelligence that modern agriculture is still trying to catch up to. Corn provides the vertical structure. Beans climb the corn stalk and fix nitrogen into the soil. Squash spreads across the ground, shading out weeds and retaining moisture. It is a closed-loop agricultural system that requires no external inputs and produces a complete nutritional profile. Modern agronomists still regard it as one of the most elegant solutions to sustainable food production ever devised. At the opposite extreme, the other end of the continent in every measurable sense, the Inuit had achieved something that may be even more remarkable. They had made the Arctic habitable, not survivable. Habitable. There is a difference. The Inuit had been living in the Arctic for over 4,000 years. They had developed clothing, layered, precisely engineered clothing, that remains the model for modern cold weather gear. The principle of trapping air between layers, of having inner garments that wick moisture away from the body, of using the specific insulating properties of specific animal furs in specific orientations, is all Inuit intellectual property, developed without laboratories or universities or published research. And the igloo. We tend to think of it as a cute, slightly primitive emergency shelter. The reality is that an igloo is a sophisticated piece of thermal architecture. The vaulted dome transfers structural loads efficiently with no frame. The sleeping platform is elevated above the entrance tunnel, or taking advantage of the fact that warm air rises. A small oil lamp inside can maintain a temperature difference of 40 or 50 degrees between inside and outside. Now for the one that really breaks people's assumptions. In approximately 1100 AD, the same era when the Norman conquest was reshaping English history, when the Crusades were beginning, when Europe was a patchwork of feudal kingdoms, there existed, at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers near present-day St. Louis, a city, not a village, not a camp, a city. Cahokia had a population of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. For comparison, London in 1100 AD had a population of approximately 10,000. The largest cities in Europe were smaller than Cahokia. The central feature was Monk's Mound, a platform mound covering 14 acres at its base and rising 100 feet into the sky, built entirely by hand, entirely without metal tools, entirely without draft animals, by human beings moving earth with baskets. The city was organized around a large central plaza. There were at least 120 mounds, of various sizes and purposes. There was evidence of a long-distance trade network that brought copper from the Great Lakes shells from the Gulf Coast, and mica from the Appalachians. We don't know what language Cahokia's residents spoke. We don't know what they called themselves. What we know is that they were here, that they built something extraordinary, and that, for most of American history, that something has been either ignored or actively suppressed, because acknowledging it complicates the story that the land was empty. Here's something that tends to genuinely surprise modern people when they first encounter it. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, groups whose way of life most closely approximates that of pre-agricultural or semi-agricultural native peoples, suggest that these communities typically spend between 4 and 6 hours per day on subsistence activities: hunting, gathering, farming, cooking, maintaining shelters and tools, the necessities of life. 4 to 6 hours. The average American today works approximately 8 hours per day, and that's just the paid work. Add the commute, the household labor, the digital obligations, the administrative overhead of modern existence, and the number climbs considerably higher. The ancient, pre-contact native was not grinding through 16-hour days of desperate survival. For much of the year, in many environments, life moved at a pace we would recognize as leisurely. There was time to talk, to rest, to make things beautiful, to tell stories, to simply exist without the tyranny of a scheduled obligation. In terms of time, in terms of the fundamental human experience of having enough hours in a day to do more than survive, the picture is more complicated than progress narratives suggest. Where you wake up depends entirely on where you are and who you are. If you're on the Great Plains, if you're Lakota or Cheyenne or Arapaho, you wake in a teepee, not the camping supply teepee of 20th century nostalgia. The real article, a cone of 11 to 22 carefully tanned and prepared buffalo hides, stretched over a framework of 15 to 20 pine poles, anchored with wooden stakes, equipped with an adjustable smoke hole at the apex that functions like a rudimentary ventilation system. The design has been refined by generations of engineering minds working on a very specific problem. How do you build a shelter that is warm in winter, cool in summer, stable in wind, and can be completely disassembled and moved by 2 people in 20 minutes? The teepee is the answer. The conical shape deflects wind. The double-walled inner liner traps insulating air. The adjustable smoke flaps allow temperature regulation. Inside, the space is organized with the precision of long habit. The sleeping areas are elevated slightly on beds of willow or cottonwood branches covered with robes and blankets. At the back, the place of honor, the sacred objects, medicine bundles, ceremonial items, things that require proximity to the center of the household, but protection from the casual traffic of everyday life. 2,000 miles east, you wake in a Haudenosaunee longhouse, and the contrast could not be more complete. The longhouse can be 200 feet long and 20 to 30 feet wide, housing anywhere from 6 to 20 families under a single continuous roof of bent saplings covered in elm bark. There is no privacy in the European sense. Everything, sleeping, eating, sickness, birth, death, happens within earshot of multiple families. You might expect this to be miserable. The accounts suggest otherwise. The longhouse was warm in winter. All those bodies in an enclosed space generate remarkable amounts of heat. The continuous presence of extended family provided childcare, elder care, and the kind of dense social support network that modern humans spend fortunes in therapy trying to replicate. You were never alone. That was the point. Here's the food fact that genuinely changes how you think about this. The agricultural output of some native farming societies was measurably superior to that of contemporary European agriculture. More calories per acre, more complete nutritional profile, greater resistance to drought and pest, lower input requirements. European observers who arrived expecting to find crude scratching in the dirt were frequently astonished. Here were fields of corn 12 feet tall. Here were orchards of carefully maintained fruit trees. Here were irrigation systems that functioned, in some cases, more efficiently than the Spanish systems the colonizers had brought with them. The three sisters worked because they were designed to work together. The corn varieties native peoples had developed were adapted to specific microclimates and specific culinary purposes. There were sweet corns and starchy corns and popping corns and grinding corns. The beans fixed nitrogen into soil depleted by the corn. The squash protected the soil moisture and suppressed weeds. The whole system was more productive than any of its components independently. On the plains, the diet was almost entirely meat, principally bison, and for good reason. A single adult bison provided several hundred pounds of meat, enough to sustain a family for weeks, along with hide for shelter and clothing, bones for tools, sinew for thread and bowstrings, stomach lining for water containers, and dried dung for fuel on the treeless plains. Nothing was wasted, not a gram. The ethics of the hunt were not primarily sentimental, they were practical. And everywhere there was trade. A vast, continent-spanning network of exchange-connected communities separated by thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes appeared in ceremonial objects in Florida. Shells from the Gulf Coast wound up as decoration in the upper Midwest. Obsidian from volcanic deposits in present-day Wyoming found its way into the hands of people who had never seen a volcano. This was not a collection of isolated communities. This was an interconnected economic and cultural system of enormous sophistication. In a world without writing, or in most cases, without writing in the European sense, memory was everything. The oral traditions of native peoples were not simply stories in the casual sense we use that word. They were the entire accumulated knowledge of a civilization, history, law, geography, ecology, astronomy, medicine, moral philosophy, and spiritual practice, encoded in narrative form and preserved across generations through rigorous memorization and ritualized transmission. A Haudenosaunee elder reciting the great law of peace was not telling a story. They were reciting a constitution, one that had to be transmitted with perfect fidelity, because any corruption in the transmission corrupted the law itself. Music was not entertainment. Music was infrastructure. Work songs coordinated collective labor. Healing songs were considered to have genuine efficacy. Ceremonial songs were property, owned by specific families or clans, inherited along with material goods, and could not be sung without permission. The drum was the heartbeat. In most traditions, the drum was literally identified with the heartbeat of the earth, and the act of drumming was an act of synchronization with that heartbeat. Death songs, songs composed by warriors in anticipation of dying in battle or by execution, were performed at the moment of death with the same ritualized precision as any other ceremony. There are accounts of captives being burned alive who sang their death songs through the entire ordeal, never breaking, never pleading, maintaining their dignity by the sheer force of their commitment to the ceremony of dying. We will come back to this. Here's where the comfortable version of this history most completely falls apart. There is a persistent and popular narrative. You'll find it in certain academic circles, in certain documentary traditions, in certain strands of the environmental movement, that pre-contact North America was a largely peaceful place where indigenous peoples lived in harmony with each other and with the natural world, a paradise of sustainable living disrupted by the violence of European colonization. This narrative is not history. It is a political position dressed in the clothes of history. And like all such impostures, it does more harm than good, because it is not only factually inaccurate, it is profoundly disrespectful to the people it claims to honor. It turns complex human beings with rich and varied histories into props in a morality play about European guilt. The archaeological record is unambiguous. Violence between human groups in pre-contact North America was widespread, recurring, and in some places extremely intense. The question is not whether it happened. The question is what kind of violence it was, what purposes it served, and how it fits into the broader picture of the civilizations that practiced it. To understand native warfare, you have to first understand that it was not primarily about territory in the European sense. Europeans fought wars to take land, to expand the power of their state, to control trade routes or resources. These were material conflicts with material objectives. Many native conflicts operated on a completely different logic. They were fought for honor, for revenge, for the spiritual advancement of the warrior, and, paradoxically, to prevent the complete annihilation that truly unlimited warfare would have produced. Consider the practice of counting coup, which was common across many Plains tribes. The word coup is French. The practice was given that name by French observers who watched, bewildered, as warriors did something that made no strategic sense by European standards, charging directly at an armed enemy, touching them with a bare hand or a specially designated coup stick, and then escaping. No kill, just touch. Why? Because in the value system of these warrior cultures, physical proximity to a dangerous enemy was itself the proof of courage. You could shoot someone from a distance with an arrow. That took skill. But it didn't demonstrate the specific quality most valued: the willingness to expose yourself to death in the performance of your function. The accumulation of coup governed everything. Your ability to marry a desirable woman, your standing in council, your right to speak. A young man without coup was a non-person. An old man with extensive coup was royalty. This created a form of warfare that was, in some ways, constrained. If the goal is to accumulate coup, you want your enemy alive and dangerous enough to count. Dead enemies who never posed a threat are worth less. The system was calibrated to make courage the most valuable currency, and it produced warriors who were, by most accounts, among the most genuinely brave human beings who ever lived. But here is the other side of it. At Crow Creek, in what is now South Dakota, archaeologists in the 1970s discovered a mass grave containing the skeletal remains of approximately 500 people, apparently killed in a single catastrophic event around 1325 AD, roughly a century and a half before Columbus arrived. The bones showed clear evidence of scalping, decapitation, and dismemberment. Men, women, children, the entire range of ages. Skulls had been split. Hands and feet had been removed, apparently as trophies. The evidence suggested that an entire village had been systematically massacred by a neighboring group. This was not European violence. This predated European contact by 6 or 7 generations. Scalping, the removal of the scalp as a trophy, and proof of a kill, is often attributed in popular culture to European influence or encouragement. The reality is more complicated. Archaeological evidence suggests scalping was practiced on this continent for at least 1,000 years before Columbus. It was widespread, documented, and carried genuine cultural meaning. Torture was also practiced, and this is perhaps the hardest aspect of pre-contact native life for modern people to sit with. In many traditions, captive enemies were not simply killed. They were brought back to the village and subjected to extended public torture, sometimes lasting days, in which virtually all members of the community participated. Women and children joined in. From the outside, this looks like sadism at scale. From within the value system that produced it, the captive who endured without screaming, without begging, who maintained his composure and sang his death song through the most extreme pain imaginable, demonstrated a kind of courage that the entire community, including his torturers, could recognize and respect. None of this makes it less horrifying, but horrifying and human are not mutually exclusive categories. The history of every civilization includes practices that later generations find incomprehensible. The violence was cyclical in a way that had its own terrible logic. Raid begets raid. Death demands death. The obligation to avenge a kinsman killed by an enemy was not optional in most of these traditions. It was a moral imperative as binding as any law. Failure to avenge was a form of shame that attached not just to the individual who failed, but to the entire family group. This created a system in which peace required enormous effort to achieve and almost no effort to destroy. A single raid, a single revenge killing, a single insult that escalated could restart a cycle of violence that had been dormant for years. The Haudenosaunee understood this better than most. The Great Law was explicitly designed to interrupt these cycles. The ceremony of condolence acknowledged that grief drives revenge and created a formal mechanism for channeling grief into ceremony rather than combat. The Iroquois Confederacy also fought brutal, expansionist wars. The Beaver Wars of the mid-17th century devastated and dispersed dozens of neighboring peoples across a vast region of the Northeast. The same civilization that gave the world a working federal democracy also, when it served their interests, acted with ferocious military aggression. Both things were true. That's the point. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with 16 horses. This is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential cargo manifests in American history. Horses had once been native to North America. They evolved here, alongside the mammoths and the saber-toothed cats of the Pleistocene megafauna. When those megafauna went extinct, roughly 12,000 years ago, horses went with them. For 10 millennia, the continent was horseless. Human beings got around on foot or by water. The travois, a frame dragged by dogs, was the primary overland freight technology. Then the Spanish brought them back. Cortez's 16 horses were the vanguard. Over the next century, Spanish colonization of Mexico and the Southwest introduced tens of thousands of horses to the continent. The Spanish tried to keep them from native peoples. They understood that horses meant power. But horses escaped. They were stolen. They were traded. By the late 1600s, horses were spreading across the Great Plains like wildfire. The rate of spread was astonishing. By 1650, horses had reached the tribes of the southern plains. By 1700, the technology had spread to the Middle Plains. By 1750, it had reached the northern plains and was still moving. The transformation of native cultures that followed was so rapid and so complete that it has few parallels in human history outside of industrial revolutions. Before horses, a person walking in good conditions could cover perhaps 15 to 20 miles a day. With a loaded horse, a rider could cover 50 to 70 miles per day. With a string of horses, rotating mounts, a determined rider could cover 100 miles in a day. The implications for every aspect of life were immediate and profound. Hunting first, the buffalo hunt before horses was a perilous, labor-intensive enterprise. The primary technique, driving a herd over a cliff, required precise coordination of dozens of people, was dependent on specific geographic features, and produced massive kills that had to be processed immediately before spoilage. On horseback, you could ride alongside a running buffalo and put arrows into it at point-blank range. You could select specific animals. You could kill multiple bison in a single chase. A skilled hunter on a trained horse could, in a good afternoon's hunting, harvest enough meat to sustain a family for weeks. The food supply exploded. Populations that had been constrained by the difficulty of hunting now found themselves with surpluses. Leisure time expanded. The political and social structures that had evolved around scarcity began to reorganize around abundance. And then there was warfare. Everything that made horses revolutionary for hunting also made them revolutionary for combat. Speed, range, the ability to strike and withdraw before a response could be organized. Raiding parties that once could travel 100 miles from home base now had effective ranges of 500 miles or more. Plains warriors developed a style of mounted combat that, by universal testimony of the soldiers and enemies who faced it, had no equal in the world. They learned to ride at full gallop with no hands, guiding the horse by knee pressure alone. They learned to drop below the horse's flank, shielding their body behind the animal's mass while firing from beneath its neck. They could loose 20 arrows in the time it took a musket soldier to complete one reload sequence, and they could do it while moving at 30 miles per hour. A U.S. Army officer who observed Comanche horsemen performing their battle drills wrote in his report that he would not willingly trade a company of these warriors for any European cavalry he had ever commanded. The horse also reorganized social structure in ways that had consequences for everything downstream. Before horses, wealth in most plains societies was relatively constrained. You owned what you could carry. Status came from personal qualities: bravery, wisdom, generosity, skill. These things couldn't be hoarded. You couldn't inherit courage. Horses could be accumulated, multiplied, stolen, traded, and inherited. A wealthy man might own 200 horses. A poor man might own none. This was a level of economic inequality that the pre-horse plains had never seen, and it reshuffled social hierarchies with remarkable speed. The transformation happened in less than a century. From the arrival of the first wild horses to the emergence of the fully mounted warrior cultures that would terrorize 3 nations for 200 years was approximately 3 generations. In historical terms, that's the blink of an eye. By the time American settlers started pushing west in large numbers, they encountered a world that was only a few generations old. The traditional Plains Indian culture, the one with the teepees and the buffalo hunts, and the mounted warriors in feathered headdresses, was younger than the United States Constitution. In the late 1600s, there was a small, unremarkable group of Shoshonean-speaking people living in the high country of present-day Wyoming. They were not particularly numerous. They were not particularly powerful. By the standards of the continent they inhabited, they were not distinctive in any notable way. Their name was Comanche. It is believed to derive from a Ute word meaning enemy or those who are against us. Within 80 years of acquiring horses, the Comanche had created an empire larger than France. They had stopped the northward expansion of the Spanish Empire cold. They had driven the Apache from the southern plains. They had reduced the population of the Spanish frontier province of Coahuila by raiding so extensively that entire regions were abandoned. And they had become, by the testimony of virtually every military force that engaged them, the most effective light cavalry in the history of the world. Not the Americas, the world. The Comanche were an imperial power in the full sense of the term. They controlled territory. They extracted tribute. They regulated trade. They projected military force over vast distances. The fact that their empire was organized around horses and mobility rather than fixed settlements and bureaucracies doesn't make it less of an empire. It makes it a different kind of empire, one that was, in many ways, more efficient and more durable than the ones trying to contain it. To understand how the Comanche achieved this, you need to understand what a Comanche warrior on horseback actually represented. Children were introduced to horses as infants. By age 5, Comanche children were riding. By 10, they were riding well enough to be useful in practical situations. By adulthood, the horse and rider were not 2 entities with a cooperative relationship, but a single organism with 8 legs and a composite intelligence. The famous Comanche battle technique, dropping below the horse's flank, hanging by a heel hooked over the horse's spine, invisible to an approaching enemy, firing arrows from beneath the horse's neck at 30 miles per hour, requires a physical intimacy with the animal that takes years of daily practice to achieve. It is not a trick that can be taught in a training program. It has to be lived into. Their rate of fire was approximately 20 arrows per minute, with lethal accuracy at ranges up to 30 yards. A U.S. Army soldier with the standard muzzle-loading rifle of the 1840s could fire 3 rounds per minute, only while standing still. The Texas Rangers were founded in 1835 specifically to counter the Comanche threat and failed at the task for years. The early Rangers fought like European-trained infantry, coordinated, disciplined, line-based. The Comanche were none of these things. They were fluid. They were individual. They operated in small, fast-moving units that could converge for devastating strikes and disperse before any organized response could be mounted. It took the Rangers years of painful learning, adopting the Comanche's own tactics, switching to the newly developed Colt revolver that could fire multiple rounds without reloading, hiring Comanche and Apache scouts before they began to develop anything approaching tactical parity. The Comancheria, the Comanche homeland, stretched across what is now Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Within this territory, the Comanche set the terms. Trade routes could only operate with Comanche permission, and that permission had a price. Spanish and later Mexican settlements on the edges of the Comancheria paid tribute in exchange for the ability to exist. When settlements declined to pay, or when the Comanche decided to make a point about power, the consequences were swift and thorough. The Great Raid of 1840 saw Comanche warriors ride hundreds of miles deep into the heart of Texas, destroying settlements from the Colorado River to the Gulf Coast, killing hundreds, taking captives and horses by the thousands, and retreating north before any organized military response could intercept them. The Comanche also maintained one of the most significant slave raiding and slave trading operations in North American history. Captives taken in raids could be adopted into the tribe, ransomed back to their communities, traded to Spanish and Mexican merchants, or kept as laborers. This is not a comfortable fact, but it happened. Here is a piece of history that almost nobody in the United States learns in school, and that has direct consequences for the shape of the country they live in. Why does English dominate north of the Rio Grande and Spanish dominate south of it? The conventional answer involves the Mexican-American War, manifest destiny, and various colonization patterns. All true, as far as it goes, but there is an earlier, more proximate factor that rarely appears in this analysis. The Comanche stopped Spanish expansion cold. For 150 years, from roughly the 1720s to the 1870s, Spain and then Mexico attempted to push their northern frontier north. They built missions, they established settlements, they sent soldiers. The Comanche destroyed the missions, razed the settlements, and killed or captured the soldiers. The line held not because of geography or any property of the Rio Grande itself, but because north of it was Comanche territory, and the Comanche had demonstrated repeatedly that the price of crossing that line without their permission was catastrophic. The American frontier, when it arrived in force in the 1840s and 1850s, did not simply walk into empty space. It walked into a territory that had been defended against the most powerful European empire in the Western Hemisphere for a century and a half, and that had won. In 1492, Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas. This is, depending on your perspective, the beginning of the modern world, or the beginning of the end of an ancient one. It was a collision between two biological worlds that had been separated for at least 12,000 years. The consequences were not immediate in the obvious ways. The actual destruction came not from what Europeans brought deliberately, but from what they carried unknowingly. Microbes, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, cholera, bubonic plague. These diseases had evolved over centuries in the dense, interconnected, domesticated animal-adjacent populations of Eurasia. Europeans had been exposed to them for generations. Their immune systems had adapted. Native American populations had none of this exposure. Their immune systems had no template for these pathogens. The best current estimates suggest that between 1492 and 1600, the indigenous population of the Americas fell by approximately 90%. 9 out of 10 people. In some regions, the rate was even higher. The Caribbean islands where Columbus first landed were, within 50 years, functionally depopulated. The diseases moved faster than the people who carried them, spreading along trade networks, jumping from population to population, ahead of any European explorer or settler. The forests and fields that looked empty to European eyes had, in many cases, not always been empty. They had been populated, in some instances densely, by peoples who had died in their homes before anyone from the other side of the ocean arrived to see the aftermath. The empty land was a graveyard that hadn't been cleaned up yet. There is a moment in the story of the American West that is, in retrospect, one of the most calculated acts of strategic destruction in modern history. It was not carried out in the fog of war. It was carried out deliberately, openly, with the full knowledge of the participants that they were dismantling the material foundation of a civilization. The buffalo. Between 1870 and 1885, a 15-year window, commercial hunters killed approximately 30 million bison on the southern and central plains. At the beginning of this period, tens of millions of bison ranged the plains. At the end of it, the species was functionally extinct in the wild. A skilled shooter could kill 100 animals without moving from his position. The hides were valuable. The meat, hundreds of pounds per animal, was mostly left to rot. The plains were carpeted with decomposing carcasses so densely that travelers reported smelling them from miles away. General Philip Sheridan reportedly argued that the hide hunters had done more in 2 years to end the Indian problem than the army had done in 30 years. They were destroying the material foundation of the Plains Indians' way of life. He was correct. Without the buffalo, there was nothing. The teepee couldn't be built. The food supply disappeared. The clothing, the tools, the fuel, everything that sustained life on the treeless plains was gone. Within a decade of the Great Slaughter, the peoples who had lived by the buffalo were starving. Their ability to resist, to move, to exist as they had existed, all of it collapsed simultaneously. This was not a military defeat in the conventional sense. The people who had fought the Comanche to a near standstill for a century were not defeated by soldiers. They were defeated by the systematic destruction of their food supply. Between the founding of the United States and the end of the Indian Wars, the federal government negotiated approximately 570 treaties with Native American nations. These were formal legal agreements, signed by authorized representatives of both parties, ratified by the U.S. Senate, and entered into the official record of the nation's legal history. By any honest accounting, the United States broke every single one. Not most, every single one. The pattern was consistent enough that it could be described as a policy, even if it was never articulated as such. A treaty would be negotiated, typically at a moment when native peoples had sufficient military capacity to force the government to the table. The treaty would establish boundaries. Then, settlers would push past those boundaries. The government, faced with the choice between enforcing the treaty and satisfying its voting citizens, would choose its voting citizens. A new treaty would be negotiated. The process repeated. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, in which Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry into a catastrophic ambush by a combined force of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors under the strategic leadership of Sitting Bull and the tactical command of Crazy Horse, was not a senseless attack on innocent soldiers. It was a direct consequence of treaty violation. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota. When gold was discovered there in 1874, the guarantee became inconvenient. The government ordered the Lakota to report to reservations. The Lakota refused. Little Bighorn was the military enforcement of that order. Little Bighorn was a victory. It was also the beginning of the end. The American public demanded retribution. Within months, the Lakota were shattered and their leaders were dead, exiled, or on reservations. On the morning of December 29, 1890, a band of Minneconjou Lakota under the leadership of Chief Bigfoot were camped on Wounded Knee Creek in what is now South Dakota. They were traveling toward the Pine Ridge Reservation under an army escort. Bigfoot himself was sick with pneumonia, riding in a wagon. The soldiers were nervous. There had been tension throughout the Great Sioux Nation over the ghost dance movement, a spiritual revival with a prophetic message. Dance, and the buffalo would return, and the dead would rise. The army, profoundly misunderstanding what it was looking at, saw an imminent uprising. The soldiers demanded the band surrender their weapons. No one has ever established definitively who fired a shot. The Hotchkiss mountain guns that surrounded the camp opened fire. When the shooting stopped, at least 250 Lakota were dead, perhaps as many as 300. The majority were women and children. Bodies were found scattered for half a mile in the direction of flight, shot in the back. Wounded Knee is generally marked as the end of the Indian Wars. The era of armed resistance was over. What came next was a different kind of assault, not on the body, but on the self. Starting in the 1870s and continuing well into the second half of the 20th century, the United States government pursued a policy of forced cultural assimilation for Native American children. The institutional vehicle was the Indian boarding school. The philosophy was stated explicitly by the man most associated with the system's founding, Captain Richard Henry Pratt. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Children, some as young as 5, were forcibly removed from their families, transported hundreds of miles to residential schools, stripped of their clothing and traditional dress, given new names in English, and forbidden, under threat of physical punishment, to speak their native languages. Their hair, which carried enormous spiritual and cultural significance in most traditions, was cut. The goal was not education in any meaningful sense. The goal was the destruction of cultural identity through the targeted elimination of language, religion, and community. A generation of children who returned from boarding schools found themselves unable to communicate with their own grandparents, unable to participate in ceremonies they had been taught were shameful, unable to occupy either the world they had come from or the world they had been trained for. Many did not return at all. Disease was rampant in the schools. Abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, was widespread. Children died and were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds, far from their families, with no notification to parents who might search for them for years. This was not ancient history. The last federally supported Indian boarding school did not close until 1973. There are people alive today who attended them. The total indigenous population of what is now the continental United States before European contact is debated among historians, with estimates ranging from roughly 2 million to as high as 18 million. Whatever the pre-contact number, the population fell through disease, warfare, starvation, forced relocation, and cultural destruction to approximately 250,000 by 1900. Think about that ratio. Whatever the pre-contact ceiling was, the population had fallen to a number in the low hundreds of thousands by the turn of the 20th century. Depending on which pre-contact estimate you accept, that represents a population loss of somewhere between 85 and 98%. The majority of that loss was to disease, which most historians agree was largely unintentional in its initial transmission. But the policies that followed, the deliberate destruction of the buffalo, the forced relocations, the broken treaties, the boarding schools, were not accidental. They were choices made by governments, documented in writing, debated in legislatures, carried out by institutions. This is the history, not the simplified version, not the comfortable version. This one. Here's what surprises most people about the end of this story. There is one, and not just an end. There is a continuation, a recovery, a persistence so stubborn and so remarkable that it deserves, after everything that came before, to be called by its right name: survival. Today, there are approximately 5.5 million people in the United States who identify as Native American or Alaska Native. The population that fell to 250,000 at the beginning of the 20th century has grown back more than 20-fold in the century since. There are 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States, each of them a sovereign entity with its own government, its own laws, and its own relationship with the federal government. That sovereignty is limited, contested, and frequently undermined. But it exists. It has legal standing. It is more than most peoples who were conquered and nearly destroyed ever retained. Languages survive. Navajo is spoken by approximately 170,000 people. Cherokee, Ojibwe, Lakota, Dakota, Choctaw. These languages are spoken, taught, recorded, transmitted to children in schools and in homes. Language revitalization programs, immersion schools, digital archives, apps designed to make fluency accessible to people who grew up speaking only English, ceremonies that were banned, literally made illegal under federal law, were practiced in secret through the decades of prohibition and have emerged into open practice. The sun dance, the potlatch, the sweat lodge, things that the government tried to stamp out, endured underground, passed from keeper to keeper through generations of resistance. In 1975, the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, a formal abandonment of the long-standing federal policy of termination and assimilation, and a formal recognition that tribal nations had the right to govern themselves. This was not a gift. It was the result of decades of organizing, legal battles, and direct action. The American Indian Movement, AIM, founded in 1968 in Minneapolis, brought the political grievances of Native peoples into the national conversation in ways that could not be ignored. The occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973 lasted 71 days and ended with negotiations between AIM representatives and federal officials, the first time in a century that the U.S. government had sat across a table from armed Native American resistance on remotely equal terms. Deb Haaland, a member of Laguna Pueblo, became the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary when she was confirmed as Secretary of the Interior in 2021, the very department whose Bureau of Indian Affairs had overseen the reservation system and the boarding schools for a century and a half. Joy Harjo, a member of the Muskogee Nation, served as the United States Poet Laureate from 2019 to 2022, the first Native American to hold that position. The television series Reservation Dogs won critical acclaim for its portrayal of contemporary reservation life with the complexity and humor that the existing Hollywood vocabulary for Native American stories had never come close to achieving. We should be honest about the losses, because the persistence of survival does not erase them. Hundreds of languages are gone, not diminished, not endangered, gone. No living speakers, no recordings, nothing but fragments preserved in the field notes of 19th century anthropologists. The intellectual and cultural content of those languages, the specific ways they organized experience, the particular concepts they made available for thought, the stories they carried, is irrecoverable. Entire peoples are gone. The Beothuk of Newfoundland, the Karankawa of Texas, the Natchez of the lower Mississippi. Communities, families, traditions, and accumulated knowledge that had been developing for thousands of years, gone within decades of sustained European contact. And yet, the Lakota concept of Mitakuye Oyasin, all my relations, the recognition that human beings are embedded in a web of relationship with all living things, did not die. It is being taught. It is being practiced. It is shaping the thought and the art and the activism of living people who are choosing, consciously, to carry it forward. The resilience is not a comfortable conclusion to a tragic story. It is not a silver lining that makes the tragedy easier to accept. The losses were real. The injustices were real. The ongoing structural inequalities are real. What the resilience is, rather, is evidence. Evidence that identity, when it is deeply enough rooted, is not something that can simply be confiscated. That culture, when it has been carried carefully enough, can survive even the most systematic efforts to destroy it. So, we started tonight with an image, a feathered headdress maybe, a Thanksgiving tableau, something familiar and flat, and we've walked through something else entirely. Civilizations that built cities larger than London and democratic systems that may have helped inspire the Constitution. Warriors who were genuinely, by any objective standard, among the most militarily effective human beings who ever lived. An agricultural tradition that was, in many measurable respects, superior to the European farming that replaced it. A philosophical tradition that understood the human relationship with the natural world in terms that modern ecology is only beginning to catch up to. Also, scalping, torture, slavery, massacre, and 150 years of Comanche raids that left terror across 3 nations. Both things were true. Both things were real. Both things are necessary to understand if you want to actually understand who these people were. The simplified story, the one with noble savages or primitive peoples, with either a paradise disrupted or a void filled, doesn't do justice to the reality. And more than that, it doesn't do justice to the people themselves. It turns them into symbols when they were people. It turns their history into a lesson for someone else when it was their history. The truth is messier. The truth has complexity and violence and beauty and tragedy and, at the end, against all reasonable expectation, survival. The truth doesn't give you clean heroes and villains. It gives you human beings. We are all connected to this land, to this history, to the people who walked it before the highways were built and after the highways are gone. The story isn't over. It never is.